Welcome to Ancestral Spotlight. Today, we are stepping into one of the most infamous unsolved mysteries in modern history: the identity of Jack the Ripper. More than 130 years after the murders that terrorized the streets of London's Whitechapel district, the name Jack the Ripper continues to fascinate historians, criminologists, genealogists, and the public alike. The crimes occurred in 1888, a period when forensic science was still in its infancy. Investigators had no understanding of blood typing, no fingerprint databases, no DNA testing, and no forensic genetic genealogy. The investigation relied heavily on witness statements, circumstantial evidence, police intuition, and the limited scientific methods available at the time. Over the decades, hundreds of theories have emerged regarding the killer's identity. Suspects have included doctors, butchers, sailors, artists, criminals, and members of the upper class. Then, in the 21st century, a remarkable question emerged. Could modern DNA technology succeed where Victorian detectives failed? Some researchers claim the answer is yes. In 2014, and later publications, DNA testing performed on a shawl, allegedly connected to one of the victims, appeared to identify a suspect named Aaron Kosminski. The announcement generated worldwide headlines declaring the mystery solved, but many geneticists, forensic scientists, and historians were not convinced. Questions about contamination, the history of the evidence, the interpretation of the DNA results, and the scientific methods used continue to create intense debate. As professional genealogists and DNA researchers understand, DNA can be an incredibly powerful tool, but it must be supported by proper methodology, documented evidence, and reproducible results. In this presentation, we will examine the original murders, the suspects, the controversial DNA evidence, and whether genetic genealogy may someday provide a true answer. To understand the Jack the Ripper case, we must first understand the world in which these crimes occurred. Whitechapel was a district in the East End of London that represented the stark contrast between the wealth of the British Empire and the harsh realities faced by the urban poor. By the late 19th century, London was the largest city in the world, and the East End had become a place of severe overcrowding. Thousands of immigrants and working-class families lived in cramped tenements and common lodging houses. Entire families often occupied a single room. Some residents paid only a few pennies each night for a bed in crowded dormitories. Poverty was widespread. Employment was uncertain. Disease and alcoholism were common social problems. For women with few opportunities, survival often required difficult choices. Many of the women later associated with the Ripper murders were living in poverty, were homeless at times, and relied on occasional sex work to obtain money for food and shelter. This context is important because these women were not simply victims in a famous mystery. They were individuals with names, histories, families, and difficult lives shaped by the social conditions of Victorian England. The Ripper exploited a vulnerable population living in a neighborhood where violence was not uncommon and where police resources were stretched thin. The fear that followed the murders transformed Whitechapel into a symbol of danger and helped create one of history's first international true crime sensations. The individual known as Jack the Ripper operated in London during the autumn of 1888. The murders generally associated with the Ripper occurred between August and November of that year, although historians continue to debate exactly how many crimes should be attributed to the same person. The name Jack the Ripper first appeared in a letter sent to a London news agency in September of 1888. The letter, known as the Dear Boss letter, was signed Jack the Ripper. Whether the letter was actually written by the killer remains a matter of debate. Many historians believe it was likely a journalistic hoax created to increase newspaper sales. Regardless of its authenticity, the name captured public imagination. The Ripper became a frightening character in the public consciousness, a faceless predator stalking the dark streets of London. The case also marked a turning point in media history. Newspapers competed aggressively for information, often printing rumors, exaggerated claims, and unverified details. The combination of violent crime, anonymous letters, public fear, and sensational reporting helped create what many scholars consider the first modern media crime phenomenon. Yet despite the enormous attention, the most basic question remains unanswered. Who was Jack the Ripper? Before we discuss suspects, forensic evidence, or DNA, it is important to remember the 5 women whose deaths created the mystery we now know as the Jack the Ripper case. Too often, history remembers the killer while forgetting his victims. The canonical five is the term commonly used by historians to describe the 5 women most widely accepted as victims of the same murderer. The first was Mary Ann Nichols, often called Polly. She was approximately 43 years old, a mother of 5 children, and had experienced years of poverty and instability. The second victim was Annie Chapman, approximately 47 years old. She had once lived a relatively stable life but struggled with illness, alcoholism, and financial hardship after her marriage broke down. The third was Elizabeth Stride, a Swedish immigrant who had lived in London for many years. Her case is somewhat controversial because the injuries she suffered were different from the others, leading some researchers to question whether she was truly a Ripper victim. The fourth was Catherine Eddowes, a woman known for her intelligence and wit despite her difficult circumstances. Her murder occurred the same night as Elizabeth Stride's, a period known as the double event. The final and most brutally attacked of the canonical 5 was Mary Jane Kelly, the youngest of the victims and the only one killed indoors. These women were daughters, mothers, wives, friends, and members of their community. Their stories remind us that historical crime research should always maintain respect for the human beings at the center of the tragedy. Investigators began looking for patterns that might reveal something about the unknown murderer. The attacks occurred primarily during the late evening or early morning hours in the Whitechapel area of East London. The victims were generally women living in extreme poverty who were vulnerable because they often had to meet strangers in isolated areas. One of the most debated questions among historians is whether the murders reveal an escalating pattern of violence. The killings of Nichols and Chapman displayed certain similarities. The murders of Stride and Eddowes occurred within approximately 1 hour of each other on the same night, September 30, 1888, in what became known as the double event. Some researchers believe the murderer was interrupted during the attack on Elizabeth Stride, causing him to seek another victim shortly afterward. The murder of Mary Jane Kelly in November 1888 was the most severe and remains one of the most disturbing crime scenes in Victorian history. Because Kelly was killed inside her own room, the murderer had more time and privacy than in previous attacks. However, despite these patterns, historians still debate whether all 5 murders were committed by the same individual. This uncertainty is important because any attempt to identify Jack the Ripper through modern science depends upon knowing which evidence actually came from the killer. Today, we live in an age of 24-hour news cycles, podcasts, documentaries, and social media discussions of crime. In many ways, the Jack the Ripper case was one of the first examples of a crime becoming a worldwide media event. Newspapers in Victorian England competed aggressively to obtain new information about the murders. Reporters published witness statements, police theories, anonymous letters, and often unconfirmed rumors. This intense coverage transformed an unknown murderer into a terrifying public figure. One of the most famous pieces of correspondence was the Dear Boss letter received by the Central News Agency in late September 1888. The author mocked police and signed the letter with the name Jack the Ripper. Whether the killer actually wrote the letter remains highly disputed. Many historians believe it was likely created by a journalist or someone seeking attention. Nevertheless, the name survived. More than a century later, we do not remember the anonymous murderer by any real name. We remember the fictional identity created through media. The legend of Jack the Ripper is therefore not only a murder mystery but also a story about the power of newspapers to shape public memory. When modern audiences examine the Jack the Ripper case, it is easy to ask why the police failed to catch him. However, we must remember the limitations of criminal investigations in 1888. The science that we take for granted today simply did not exist. DNA profiling would not be developed for nearly 100 years. Fingerprint identification had not yet been adopted as a standard investigative tool in Britain. Blood typing was still unknown. Investigators relied on witness testimony, physical observations, informants, and traditional detective work. The Metropolitan Police, led by investigators including Inspector Frederick Aberline, conducted a massive investigation. Officers interviewed thousands of people, collected hundreds of statements, and examined numerous suspects. Many suspects appeared promising, but there was no scientific evidence capable of conclusively connecting anyone to the crimes. This lack of definitive evidence is exactly why the case survived into the modern age. If even a tiny amount of reliable biological material from the killer had survived, blood, saliva, skin cells, or another uncontaminated sample, Modern forensic science might have the ability to answer the question that Victorian detectives could not. But that word is critical: reliable. The greatest challenge in the Jack the Ripper DNA debate is not whether DNA can identify a person. It absolutely can. The challenge is proving that the DNA being tested actually belonged to the killer. One of the reasons the Jack the Ripper mystery has endured for so long is the enormous number of potential suspects. Over the past century, historians, amateur investigators, and writers have proposed more than 100 possible identities for the killer. Today, we will discuss some of the most frequently cited suspects. One of the most famous is Aaron Kosminski, a Polish-born Jewish immigrant who lived in Whitechapel during the time of the murders. Kosminski worked as a barber and later suffered from severe mental illness, eventually being committed to an asylum. Several police officials writing years after the murder suggested that Kosminski had been a strong suspect, although no definitive evidence was produced during his lifetime. His name became even more prominent in the 21st century after DNA testing on a controversial shawl, allegedly linked to victim Catherine Eddowes, suggested a possible connection to his maternal lineage. Another frequently discussed suspect is Montague John Drute, a barrister and schoolteacher whose death shortly after the murders caused some investigators to suspect him. However, there is little direct evidence connecting him to Whitechapel or the crimes. George Chapman, born Severin Klasowski, was another serious suspect. He was a Polish-born barber who later became a convicted serial murderer after poisoning 3 of his wives. Some investigators considered him capable of the violent scene in the Ripper murders, although his known method of killing was very different. Another notable suspect was Francis Tumblety, an American doctor who was in London during the murders. His unusual behavior, misogynistic comments, and criminal history brought him to the attention of police. The difficulty with all of these suspects is the same. None can be conclusively tied to the murders using contemporary evidence. This is why the possibility of DNA evidence generated so much excitement. For the first time, it seemed possible that a suspect might be scientifically connected to the crimes. One of the greatest challenges in solving a 19th century crime is that very little physical evidence survives. Modern criminal investigations carefully preserve evidence using gloves, sterile containers, controlled environments, and documented chains of custody. None of those practices existed in 1888. Crime scenes were often crowded with police officers, medical examiners, journalists, and curious members of the public. Objects were handled repeatedly, moved, and sometimes even taken as souvenirs. The most important surviving materials from the Ripper investigation are not biological evidence, but documents. These include police reports, witness statements, coroner's records, and contemporary newspaper accounts. Several letters supposedly written by Jack the Ripper also survive, including the famous Dear Boss letter and the From Hell letter. However, most experts believe many of these letters were likely hoaxes. If a letter did truly come from the killer and contained an uncontaminated seal or saliva sample, it could theoretically provide valuable DNA evidence. Unfortunately, proving authenticity after more than 130 years would be extraordinarily difficult. This brings us to the most controversial piece of alleged Ripper evidence: a Victorian shawl associated with the murder of Catherine Eddowes. The centerpiece of the modern Jack the Ripper DNA controversy is a shawl allegedly recovered near the body of Catherine Eddowes on September 30, 1888. According to the story passed down through generations, a police officer present at the crime scene obtained the shawl and kept it in his family. Eventually, it came into the possession of a private owner, who arranged for scientific testing. Supporters of the shawl's authenticity argue that it may contain biological material left by both the victim and the killer. Critics point out several serious concerns. The first problem is the chain of custody. In forensic science, a chain of custody is the documented history of where an item has been, who handled it, and how it was preserved. The shawl lacks a clear, continuous record connecting it to the crime scene. Second, the item was handled by countless individuals over more than a century. Every person who touched the fabric potentially deposited their own DNA. This is especially problematic with modern techniques, which are sensitive enough to detect tiny amounts of genetic material. Finally, some historians question whether the shawl even belonged to Catherine Eddowes, noting that there is no definitive record in the original police files confirming that such a shawl was collected from the scene. Therefore, before we even examine the DNA results, we must ask a more basic question. Are we testing the killer's DNA or simply the DNA of people who touched an old piece of fabric? DNA may seem like an infallible technology, but the reality is much more complex, especially when dealing with historical evidence. DNA is a biological molecule that naturally degrades over time. Heat, moisture, sunlight, bacteria, and environmental conditions all cause DNA strands to break into smaller fragments. Scientists working with ancient DNA often deal with extremely tiny pieces of genetic information. The challenge is not only recovering DNA, but determining whether it actually belongs to the historical person being studied. For example, researchers have successfully extracted DNA from ancient human remains thousands of years old. However, those studies are conducted under extremely controlled archaeological and laboratory conditions. The Jack the Ripper shawl is a very different situation. It was not stored as a scientific sample, it passed through private hands, was displayed publicly, and was handled repeatedly. Every touch introduced the possibility of additional DNA. This is why forensic scientists are extraordinarily cautious. A DNA result is only as trustworthy as the evidence from which it came. In the Jack the Ripper case, the controversy is not simply about whether DNA can identify a person. It is about whether the DNA being tested can be confidently linked to the murderer. To understand the modern Jack the Ripper DNA claims, we need to discuss a very specific type of DNA. Mitochondrial DNA, often abbreviated as mtDNA. Unlike autosomal DNA, which we inherit from both parents and which recombines every generation, mitochondrial DNA follows a direct maternal line. Every person receives their mitochondrial DNA from their mother. However, only daughters pass it on to the next generation. Because mitochondrial DNA changes very slowly, it can survive as a genetic signature across many generations. This makes mtDNA extremely useful for historical and ancient DNA research. For example, mitochondrial DNA has been used to identify historical remains, compare ancient populations, and confirm maternal relationships when no close relatives are available. However, mtDNA has an important limitation. A mitochondrial DNA match does not uniquely identify one person. Thousands or potentially millions of people can share the same or very similar mitochondrial DNA profile, especially common haplotypes. Therefore, a match can tell us that a person could belong to a particular maternal line. It cannot, by itself, prove that a specific individual was the source of the DNA. This distinction is one of the central points in the debate surrounding the Jack the Ripper evidence. In 2014, researchers announced that DNA testing performed on the shawl, allegedly linked to Catherine Eddowes, had produced a remarkable result. The testing reportedly identified mitochondrial DNA consistent with living descendants of both Catherine Eddowes and Aaron Kosminski. The implication was dramatic. If the DNA truly came from the shawl, and if the shawl truly came from the crime scene, and if the biological material had remained uncontaminated for over a century, then the evidence could suggest that Aaron Kosminski had been present. The story generated worldwide media attention. Many newspapers and documentaries announced that the greatest unsolved murder mystery in history had finally been solved. However, many experts immediately urged caution. Science does not operate on a single exciting result. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And in the Jack the Ripper case, there were several major concerns that remained unresolved. The controversy surrounding the Jack the Ripper DNA evidence demonstrates one of the most important lessons in genetic genealogy. DNA must always be interpreted in context. The first major concern is the chain of custody of the shawl. In modern forensic investigations, every individual who handles an item of evidence is documented. This creates a clear history that allows investigators to know whether contamination may have occurred. The Ripper shawl does not have that level of documentation. The second issue is contamination. For more than 130 years, the shawl was handled, transported, displayed, and studied. Modern DNA technology is so sensitive that even a tiny amount of DNA from a later handler can be detected. Another concern is the nature of mitochondrial DNA itself. Even if the mtDNA sequence is correctly identified, it does not point to a single individual. It can only indicate that the person belonged to a maternal line shared by many people. Finally, scientific findings become stronger when independent researchers can examine the evidence, reproduce the results, and reach the same conclusion. Many forensic scientists argue that the current evidence does not meet the standard required to officially close the case. As a result, despite sensational headlines, Jack the Ripper remains legally and historically unidentified. This is where we move from traditional forensic science into the field of genetic genealogy. Forensic genetic genealogy, or FGG, has transformed cold case investigations in recent years. Rather than simply asking whether a DNA sample matches a known suspect, FGG uses autosomal DNA to identify distant relatives of an unknown person. Investigators can compare an unknown DNA profile against a database of individuals who have voluntarily uploaded their DNA for law enforcement compatible searches. By finding third, fourth, or even more distant cousins, genealogists can reconstruct family trees and narrow down the identity of an unknown individual. This technique has been used successfully in numerous cold cases, including the identification of the Golden State Killer. So, could it work for Jack the Ripper? The answer is possibly, but only under the right circumstances. Investigators would need a genuine biological sample left by the killer. That sample would need to contain enough high-quality autosomal DNA to create a usable profile. The evidence would also need a credible history showing that it truly came from the crime scene and had not been contaminated. In other words, the challenge is not whether genetic genealogy is powerful enough. The challenge is whether we possess authentic DNA from Jack the Ripper at all. The public often views DNA as a magical solution capable of answering every historical mystery. As genetic genealogists, we know the reality is more complicated. DNA is an extraordinarily powerful tool, but it is only as reliable as the sample being tested and the methods used to analyze it. To truly identify Jack the Ripper through modern science, researchers would first need an authentic biological sample that could be confidently attributed to the killer. What could such a sample look like? Perhaps it would be saliva beneath a postage stamp or envelope seal from an authenticated letter written by the killer. Perhaps it would be blood, skin cells, or another biological trace preserved on an object that could be unquestionably linked to the murderer. However, even if a sample were found, scientists would need to prove that it had not been contaminated over the last 130 years. Next, the DNA would need to be of sufficient quality. A small fragment of mitochondrial DNA might suggest a broad maternal lineage, but a complete autosomal DNA profile could potentially allow forensic genetic genealogists to identify relatives, reconstruct family trees, and narrow the search to an individual. Finally, the scientific process requires replication. One laboratory result is not enough for a claim of this magnitude. Independent laboratories must be able to test the evidence and reach the same conclusion. Only when DNA, historical documentation, geography, timeline, and forensic evidence all point to the same individual could historians seriously argue that the mystery had been solved. This case represents one of the most important lessons for anyone interested in DNA, history, or genealogy. DNA can be revolutionary. It has reunited adoptees with biological families, identified unknown soldiers, solved decades-old murders, and corrected centuries of historical misunderstandings. However, DNA does not exist in a vacuum. A genetic result without context can easily be misunderstood. This is why professional genealogists do not simply look at a DNA match and declare a conclusion. We build family trees. We examine records. We study migration patterns. We evaluate historical circumstances. We ask whether the evidence actually supports the conclusion being made. The Jack the Ripper controversy is a perfect example of this principle. Even if a DNA sequence appears to connect to a suspect's family line, we still must ask, was the evidence authentic? Could the DNA have come from another source? Are there alternative explanations? Has the result been independently confirmed? The strongest historical conclusions are never built upon a single piece of evidence. They are built upon multiple independent lines of evidence that converge toward the same answer. So, after more than a century of speculation, did DNA finally reveal the identity of Jack the Ripper? The honest answer is, no, not conclusively. The DNA claims involving Aaron Kosminski are fascinating. They are worthy of study and have reignited serious discussions about the case. Kosminski was a historical suspect who lived in the right place during the right time and was considered suspicious by some police officials after the murders. However, the DNA evidence currently available does not meet the level of certainty required to declare the mystery solved. The problems with the shawl's history, the possibility of contamination, and the limitations of mitochondrial DNA all leave significant room for doubt. Could Aaron Kosminski have been Jack the Ripper? Yes. Could the evidence eventually prove he was? Possibly. Has it happened yet? No, it has not. And that distinction between possibility and proof is the heart of responsible historical and genetic research. The story of Jack the Ripper may not be over. The technology available to scientists today is dramatically more advanced than what existed even 20 years ago. Researchers can now recover DNA from ancient human remains thousands of years old. They can sequence tiny fragments of genetic material and use powerful computers to reconstruct genetic information that was once considered permanently lost. Forensic genetic genealogy has also created a revolution in criminal investigation. Cases that remained unsolved for decades have been reopened and solved by identifying distant relatives of unknown suspects. It is entirely possible that future technologies could revisit historical evidence and reveal new information. But the same principles will always apply: authenticity, documentation, replication, scientific rigor. The goal is not simply to name a suspect. The goal is to reach the truth. Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of history's most enduring mysteries. More than a century after the murders that terrified the streets of Whitechapel, the identity of Jack the Ripper continues to challenge historians, forensic scientists, and genetic genealogists. Modern DNA technology has given us extraordinary new tools that Victorian investigators could never have imagined. We can identify distant relatives through shared DNA, reconstruct family histories across centuries, and use genetic evidence to answer questions that once seemed impossible to solve. But the Jack the Ripper case also reminds us of something equally important. Science requires patience, evidence, and humility. DNA is not a magic key that unlocks every mystery. A result is only as meaningful as the quality of the evidence, the strength of the methodology, and the ability of other researchers to examine and confirm the conclusions. The story of the Ripper shawl, the claims surrounding Aaron Kosminski, and the continuing debate among scientists provide a fascinating lesson in the importance of responsible historical and genetic research. Perhaps future advances in ancient DNA technology and forensic genetic genealogy will one day provide a more definitive answer. Perhaps the true identity of Jack the Ripper has been lost to history forever. At this moment, the most honest answer remains the same. The mystery is not yet solved. And perhaps that uncertainty is one reason the case continues to fascinate us more than 130 years later. If you enjoyed this exploration of history, genealogy, DNA science, and historical mysteries, please like this video, subscribe to the Ancestral Spotlight channel, and share it with others who are passionate about discovering the stories hidden within the past. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to exploring another journey through history with you.